simplify. Righty-ho, I'm going to simplify something for maybe somebody 40 years old, maybe 45, and younger. The nuance is absolutely... So I'm going to say something that I very much doubt anybody would have the... It's not guts, it's just be able to stand back and think and say. So the nuance is critical. Three events, you could say, have happened in the last 10 days, which, even if there are bigger events, more events that in the future dominate the news agenda even more, these are big enough. So briefly, I'm somebody just purely accident of school friends who were pretty aware of the need for an international approach to peace, etc. I'm somebody who, age 17, 18, I went to a couple of demonstrations in London which were anti-nuclear. We had a fast breeder reactor that was on the cards, and there was a peace movement, and I just went along and I got it totally. But more importantly, actually, I can't even remember the dates, but in my early 20s we had the women of Greenham Common who truly dedicated their lives for several years, longer some of them, to genuine peace. It's just about peace. And I don't know about others, I guess quite a few other people thought the same as me, felt the same as me. I felt humbled, I felt small. It's like, wow, it's almost like if you're in a grown-up country, a man aged, when I was 20, you never even were allowed to think about what's going on with a woman's womb. We didn't actually have any right to comment about what the women were doing at the camp for many years at the fence of Greenham Common, where the British were going to allow Americans to put nuclear weapons. Anyway, to the point. After that, so quickly, I was a normal-ish person, but stumbled across gradually, in my mid-20s, the books, not the films, the books of John Pilger and Tariq Ali, and about 7 or 8 years later, the book by Slavenka Drakulic, which I think is about, well, it's certainly the most grown-up book about the Bosnian Wars, and because she quite rightly looked at it in the light of, well, this could happen here as well. They would never hurt a fly. It's a magnificent book, possibly even the most scary non-Pilger type of book. Pilger books looked at absolutely everything politically so carefully. Two sources for everything, and you felt humbled, but at the same time, it's like, I believe these books about how Britain is and other countries, other supposedly goody Western countries, are so dodgy behind the scenes. But here's the point. The point is this. So, my very late 20s, we had Gulf War I. Then, for me personally, then Bosnia happened, and by that time I'd already I've never touched a Yugoslav girl. There we go. Well, there's one who was a great friend of myself and a friend of mine. We sort of adopted a refugee, a younger woman, but I had a personal. I'd come to love Yugoslavia, so to see that going on the television was just so crushing. So Gulf War I, Bosnia, democrats, blah 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 blah. Then we've had okay, Libya, etc., Syria. Here's the point. Now, I suppose I was in the 5 or 10%. I wasn't somebody who spent my 20s and 30s always dressed in tie-dye with a C&D badge, etc. But I'd read those books. So, quite simply, I was kind of born serious, but that doesn't mean you can't have fun, sex, drugs and rock and roll too. I'd taken that in. There's shit. The international political scene, military-industrial complex is really hugely problematical, and it's never left me. And then when these wars came along, and here's the key thing, it's like, this is horrifying. The first two, Gulf War One and the Bosnian wars, it crushed me inside. But ever since the 10 or 20 years after that, so in my 30s and 40s, one felt kind of alone in a way, or one didn't really speak about one's real feelings and experience, because the majority, I suppose you could reasonably say 5 or 10%, genuinely were affected, genuinely. I couldn't just forget about these things. I couldn't forget about those two experiences of feeling horrified and feeling for, even in Gulf War One, sending down bombs. I knew these were Iraqi conscript young men. In Iraq, you had no choice whether or not to fight, to join the local version of Hamas or whatever. No, actually to be in the Iraqi army. If you didn't go to war age 16, you'd be told, well, your mother's going to suffer a very, very, very unpleasant death. To the point. Because what the real point is this. Your age group is lucky. Those who, like me, kind of took life seriously to a certain extent, and the majority perhaps don't want to know about life beyond their surfboard, beyond their fancy £10,000 show-off camper van, beyond their whatever, and can't change that. Maybe in time they will change, but that proportion who take life seriously, who these things, when they hear about them, see them, affect them inside. I was one of those people, and it was in the second part of the 90s, 2000s. It was a really lonely place to be, and much more than that, that the worst thing in life is to just confusion, to be unsure of what to say or think. It's like, did those things matter? Now, my point is that the great majority of people, they basically, as we did with Northern Ireland, when I was a kid, bombs going off all over the place, there's great songs of U2. We adored U2. They were just like, wow. But they were singing about some of this, but we didn't want to know about it really. But anyway, the point. Second half of 90s, 2000s, the great majority of people I'd encounter in life, they didn't want to talk about any of this. It was too difficult. Gulf War One, Bosnia, and then subsequent problematical situations, they didn't want to talk about it. It's like too difficult. It's too difficult. It's too not quite the Holocaust. Or, that's the wrong way of putting it. It's too, well, it's a long way away, and we will never really know who were the goodies and the baddies and what's the right and wrong. There's just right and wrong in this world. It was too difficult, and that is a really quite a difficult state to be in. I've kind of been in that state for the last 25 years of my life. It's like, well, I know what the score is. I've read the proper books. And we have these things that we see or hear on our news, and it's like, just no point even thinking about them, because you can't really have intelligent conversations with people about them. Your generation you're actually lucky. You're lucky. Two things have happened in the last week, which both, the second will not seem horrifying, but, well, let's just be crystal clear. It's not a case of they're not false news, which is the trendy way of speaking about things that may be a little bit confusing. History will certainly record both of them, whether or not there are other aspects to them. History will certainly record both of these things basically as the world saw them. Now, the first is the most terrible thing. My heart was bleeding when I heard the news yesterday evening. My heart was bleeding when I first heard the recordings of the little Palestinian girl Hind. It's like, fuck. Now, of course, there are thousands of Hinds that have suffered the same terrible, alone death. But to hear it, and then hear yesterday that almost certainly, even the ambulance that had been agreed with the Israeli authorities that could go and rescue her, even that had been attacked and obliterated, and the two drivers killed. That is we could call it, Hind, without a doubt, will be recorded in history as the first, hopefully the only, but obvious and frank of this terrible situation. But you see, you're lucky, you 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds. You've got it now in black and white. You've got it now. There is no doubt. And it's not a case of Israel having gone bonkers. It's a case of the way that the whole international community for decades has misbehaved or not really worked to find better solutions to sustaining peace, to disarming, etc., etc. This event, it's not a case of hopefully may change things. It may not, but you're lucky, because my generation, it's not a case of doubt. It's a case of one didn't really feel even confident to put your voice there saying, well, blah, 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 blah. Iraq, this happened. I mean, well known exactly the bad acts that happened in Iraq. And the coalition did many. It's not even about that. It's about there weren't really clear-cut examples of any people can turn into crazy mass murdering machines. You've got it in black and white. The recordings of this little girl are going to be there forever. And the second thing, now, I don't really bother with much, even alternative media now, but I was nosy enough to poke my nose into the Love Him or Loathe Him. To me, the rhetoric of all of these people is appalling, but I believe the first Western journalist to interview Putin for many years. One thing that's definitely not fake in there, or a bizarre twisting of matters by a sick man, whatever Putin is, whatever attitude you may have to the rights and wrongs of Ukraine, etc. The way he came out with, Boris Johnson scuppered the peace treaty that was being created in a few months after the Ukraine war began. Now, I'm pretty good at sussing out lies. Sorry, that was not a lie. He told the story as well. He actually told the story of everybody, or everybody there in the negotiations had initialed, and then Boris Johnson came along and just basically sabotaged the thing. He didn't have any reason to say that. There's no reason. Britain is a pathetic, irrelevant country, although behind the scenes we're very relevant, as that shows. But there's no PR gain for Russia, for Putin saying that. Had he said an American diplomat had done that, you could easily argue, well, he's just fighting with PR, with words, to make America, who's in charge, look awful. No, he said Boris Johnson, and I actually believe that. I can't think of any reason why he would have made that up. So you have seen the worst. You have it. You have the recordings of that poor little girl. Well, you have them for the rest of your lives now. You have it that Britain, behind the scenes, and one of the very few people, a really fabulous, the greatest man I've ever met by far, and the most peaceful man. It's another story, and one day I'd love to tell it properly. He actually told me he was there when he was actually in the room when the first stage of the when it looked like the Iron Curtain was coming down, or beginning to. There were meetings. I think it was in East Germany. I don't think it was in Russia, and it may have been in West Germany. But Ivan, a man I met about 8 years ago and spent 4 hours with, he was there. He was in the room, and he was explaining how the one person who was the most negative about what was happening in that room was Margaret Thatcher, and tried to delay the otherwise unanimous attitude of all the other Western leaders there, that this is a good thing, should be encouraged, and plans put in place to assist in a peaceful transition. No, Margaret Thatcher didn't want it to happen. She wanted it, let's make sure this doesn't happen, or discourage it from happening. Anyway, forgetting her, but you've got two things which mean that for the rest of your useful lives, you can be sure, if you're sitting in a pub with somebody who's talking about, well, is it this, is it that, who's to blame for this, it's like you've got two things that show. It looks like there's about 250,000 people who've either been, I think it's 80,000 people killed, and the rest 200,000, or about 175,000 so seriously injured in Ukraine. You've got two things there which are your food, which should be your sustenance. Makes it so much easier. That's all I want to say. If anybody's listening to this who's like, when I was 30, watching those wars, was it 30, 31, those wars in Bosnia on television, it's like, I just felt there's no hope for humanity. I felt horrible. And for some years, and where I was spending a lot of my time, we actually had a half Croat, half Serb, basically refugee, who'd been sort of adopted. It's like, this is just, I was numb. You're numb, you're paralyzed, you're turned into a zombie. But the following 20 years of my life was not easy, because you cannot, it's so much easier when you've got the license to be, no, sorry, arsehole sap. No, it's not like that. Just, if one is, there is no more doubt. There's no just war. There's no good reason to let off bombs. We've seen the people in the world, and okay, in this case it's a supposedly most right-wing government ever in Israel, and he may well have his almost certainly Netanyahu has his domestic agenda. He's trying to keep himself out of jail for corruption. Whatever the reasons, it doesn't matter. When the bombs go off, even the people in the world who perhaps should know better, it gets fucking horrid. And you've got a superb example there that's going to be sitting there on YouTube or wherever for the rest of your lives. You no longer have doubt. If you're somebody who's a serious-minded person, it's going to be so much easier for you to just take a bit of a stand. And maybe that will power you one day to take, because I'm afraid to say, it's all politics. Taking a bit more of a serious interest in politics. And item number three is almost a funny aside. To me it's funny. Today, apparently, the Body Shop is going bankrupt. Now, apart from the fact that when a supposedly green woman comes along and starts selling mountains more products we don't need, let's be crystal clear, even many of her products, many of the products of the Body Shop are based on, in one way or another, petrochemicals or chemicals, which is what deep down so much of these is going on behind so much of these conflicts. You're going to have to read the right books for that. I'm not going to waffle on about it. It's just fact. But you don't have to take my word for that. But what I've seen all my life is essentially Anita Roddick was one of the many fake campaigners, putting herself out, well, I'm doing this and buy my goody-goody products, which weren't really goody-goody, and all sorts of this, that and the other. I'm going to be a campaigner for goody-goodies. No, I'm sorry. This like my generation have had a generation of people like her who, because it's kind of trendy and because they can greenwash or because they can kind of formulate their PR on the back of, oh, well, we're looking after the vulnerable here, there and everywhere. No, it's not going to happen now. What's one thing for sure? It's going to take 5 years, 10 years before you may even manage to get a few more. A politician like Sarah Champion, for example, who was initially a Corbynite. You need more people like that who are going to say no more. And then, I mean, obviously you can't just say no more attacking people like the Houthis. It has to be it's going to take years, if not decades, to rebuild, having better people, more authentic people in organisations like the United Nations, etc. But I end off saying, you've got it easier. You're dealing with, if there's somebody 30 years old or 35 who's takes life seriously and who's just feeling numb, a zombie after encountering the story and voice of the little 6-year-old girl, you're going to feel a zombie for months, maybe years, but you've got it easier because you've got something so black and white that we didn't really have. Pilger wrote of probably 400,000 or at least 100,000 Iraqi conscripts who were, they were a pathetic ragtag army who were retreating up a very narrow road from Kuwait, where they'd wrongly invaded, but